The Qing Dynasty is often remembered for its grandeur, its embroidered robes, dragon-sealed edicts, and sprawling palaces shimmering beneath the Beijing sun. Yet beneath the brocade lay the bones of millions, the voiceless, nameless, and owned. These were the servants, bonded laborers, household slaves, and government chattels who powered the empire but lived and died in its shadows. To understand Qing servitude, one must first unmask the very framework of Qing society. The emperor as heaven's son. The Qing emperor was not merely a ruler, he was the son of heaven, chosen to govern all under heaven. Every man, woman, and child lived within an intricate hierarchy of obligations. But nowhere was this hierarchy steeper, or more brutal, than for those trapped at the bottom. Qing China institutionalized servitude into law. The Jianmen, the mean people, were those who, by birth or circumstance, belonged to others. They were often registered in household records as new slaves. They could not marry freely, own property, or leave without permission. Their identity was an inherited chain. "You are no longer a girl, Jin Hai," the mistress said. "You are a pair of hands. You will scrub, you will serve, and you will be silent." Jin Hai had been sold at age 8 for 7 strings of copper cash, barely enough to buy a roasted duck in a merchant's home. That transaction had no ceremony, no paperwork, no farewell. She was one of millions. Classifying the unfree. The Qing bureaucracy was meticulous. In their ledgers, people were classified as either Liangmin, good citizens, free; Jianmen, debased people, unfree. Under Jianmen were various subclasses. Bond servants, Baoi Nukai, often tied to Manchu households or the imperial bannermen, performing military or personal duties. Household slaves, domestics, cooks, and handmaids. Contract laborers, people who entered servitude to repay debts, often for generations. Punishment slaves, criminals forced into labor as state punishment. Though slavery had existed in China for millennia, the Qing refined it into a ritualized caste system, locking generations into invisibility. The banner system and servitude. One of the Qing's most striking institutions was the 8 banners, a social military structure central to Manchu dominance. Beneath each banner were bondservants attached to noble households. Many of these Baoi were Han Chinese, forcibly assimilated and marked as hereditary servants. They wore different clothes. They walked behind others. Their names were often recorded with an additional character, denoting their status. "Even a loyal dog can sleep by the fire," whispered a Baoi soldier, Li Tian, to his friend. "But we, the emperor's bondservants, are kept in the cold, buying flesh in the marketplace." Human markets were common in major cities like Suzhou, Hangzhou, and Beijing. Girls with calloused hands and boys with sunburnt backs stood silently as wealthy households picked and purchased them like livestock. Advertisements in regional gazettes read, "Healthy servant girl, age 12, obedient and skilled with needlework. No illness. 9 taels." This was not just private practice, it was state-sanctioned trade. The government issued licenses to slave traders and collected taxes on the exchange. One such trader, Zhao Mingyu, kept a ledger. Li family purchased 1 cook, male, 17, 7 taels. Wu household purchased twin sisters, age 10, 12 taels. Governor's wife purchased 4 handmaids, paid by jade. To the ruling class, these were household matters. To the enslaved, they were a death of the self. Servitude by birth. Perhaps the cruelest reality was this: slavery was hereditary. A child born to a slave mother was also a slave, even if their father was free. There was no court appeal. No escape through good service. In rural provinces, the family name became a curse. Villages had entire clans of servile lineage, their ancestors once captured in war, or punished for rebellion, or simply impoverished. These people were prohibited from entering the imperial exams, holding office, or marrying freely. "I was born barefoot," said Mei Xiu, a bonded woman in Shandong. "And I will die barefoot. That is the way of our kind." This caste system became self-reinforcing. The government posted edicts labeling mean people as incapable of virtue, and thus, unworthy of trust. How Qing law codified servitude. Qing law, under the Great Qing Legal Code, did not abolish slavery, it protected the rights of slave owners. Slaves who disobeyed could be beaten, branded, even executed, depending on the owner's rank. Some chilling excerpts include: "A servant who strikes their master shall be beheaded. A master who kills their servant without extreme cruelty shall not be punished." In one record from 1726, a Beijing merchant burned a female servant with boiling oil for dropping his opium pipe. The court ruled the act excessive, but no jail time was given, only a fine. This was not an anomaly. It was systemic. Closing reflection. While the Qing courts issued proclamations about virtue and harmony, they upheld a legal and moral structure that allowed, even encouraged, the ownership of human lives. The dragon throne rose not just on conquest, but on servitude. It was not only an empire of jade and gold, but one of blood and silence. The seeds of Qing servitude were not always planted in chains, they often began in hunger, drought, or debt. For many, bondage wasn't a sudden fall from grace but a slow erosion, where the soil cracked beneath their feet, the granaries emptied, and selling a child became an act of survival. The winter that took the sun. In the winter of 1741, northern Shandong experienced its third consecutive failed harvest. The Yellow River had flooded twice, and locusts devoured what little remained. By mid-January, government rice shipments hadn't arrived. The fields were nothing but brittle stalks and dry earth. In a small hamlet near Lini, a father stood barefoot in the snow. "Please," he whispered to the trader, bowing so low his forehead touched the frozen ground. "Just enough for a sack of millet. You can take the boy." His son, Fei, was 6. A week later, Fei was scrubbing lacquered floors in a merchant's home in Suzhou. He was too young to carry water buckets, so they tied rags to his knees and had him polish the corridors by crawling. He would never see his family again. The economic web of desperation. Bonded servitude in Qing China wasn't always legal slavery, many entered contractual bondage, known as jianmai or yai. This was a gray zone in which families pawned a person's labor, usually a child, to creditors or landlords. Theoretically temporary, in reality, it became permanent servitude. Contracts were signed by a village elder or a notary. They promised 5 to 10 years of labor for a lump sum. Most never saw the contract again. The Qing state did little to intervene. In fact, magistrates often preferred bonded laborers over free workers. They were easier to manage, less likely to protest, and often could not read. "Once the girl is in your home," said one notary to a Hangzhou widow, "the law considers her your person. She cannot leave without your consent." Debt and intergenerational chains. Peasant families often mortgaged children to repay taxes, especially during wartime or drought. If the debt remained unpaid, the child's labor would continue indefinitely, often inherited by their own children. In Fujian, a report from 1783 recorded 24 boys sold as permanent laborers for 3 to 5 taels. 17 girls sold as domestic companions, a euphemism for sexual service. 9 infants registered as future assets to landlords. One account describes a girl named Lin Yuehua, sold at age 9 to pay off her father's land debt. She worked in silence until her 20s, when she gave birth to a son. The family who owned her registered the child under their household registry, making him property by birth. "I am not her owner," said Master Chiao in a village court. "I own the debt that her womb carries." The court ruled in his favor. Ransom that never came. Many servants were told they could buy back their freedom by repaying the original debt. This was a cruel fiction. Wages were either non-existent or deducted against food, lodging, and discipline fines. Even if someone managed to collect enough money, often with the help of relatives, the owner could simply refuse release, citing increased value or personal investment. A famous case from 1805 recounts a male servant, Zhong Liang, who worked in a tea house for 17 years. When his sister tried to redeem him, the owner demanded 5 times the original price. "He knows the recipe for our smoked leaves," the tea master said. "His knowledge is my property." Zhong died 3 years later from untreated tuberculosis. The silent toll on women. Female servitude bore a second, cruel layer: sexual exploitation. Poor families sold daughters for small sums to wealthy households, not just as maids, but as concubines, wet nurses, or unpaid wives. These women had no legal recourse if assaulted, discarded, or replaced. In Nanjing, a contract read: "One girl, 13, trained in kitchen work. Chaste, gentle temperament. No red marks." The final phrase, "no red marks," was code for virginity. Sometimes families told their daughters they were being sent to serve tea. The truth came in bruises and silence. "If you refuse, they will beat your mother," one mistress warned her servant. "Your body is theirs now." This fear-based obedience turned households into prisons. Religion and cultural endorsement. Confucianism, the moral backbone of Qing society, emphasized filial piety, hierarchical order, and duty to one's superiors. While it offered ideals of kindness and compassion, it also cemented class and servitude as moral norms. Masters were likened to fathers. Servants, to dutiful sons. "A servant should obey as a river follows its banks," wrote Confucian scholar Wang Shu in 1724. Rebellion is like floodwater, it dishonors the household. These teachings were read aloud in elite academies, cited in court decisions, and copied in village schools. Even some servants internalized them, believing their suffering to be righteous, their status unchangeable. The illusion of escape. Theoretically, a servant could flee. But the consequences were severe. Fugitive notices were posted in market squares. Runaways were captured by local militia and branded. Families who harbored them were fined or imprisoned. In 1798, a runaway girl named Aishio was caught hiding in a Buddhist temple. The magistrate ordered 20 lashes and returned her to her owner, who locked her in a granary for 5 days with no food. Her name disappeared from the village census the following year. Closing reflection. Bonded servitude in Qing China was a web of desperation, debt, and dishonesty. What began as temporary arrangements turned into lifelong shackles, passed from parent to child like a blood-stained heirloom. Behind every imperial banquet, every ornate garden party, was a story like Fei's, or Lin Yuehua's, not recorded in chronicles, but carved in silence. Beyond the red lacquered gates of the Forbidden City, where peacocks strolled through pebble-lined courtyards and silken banners fluttered in the wind, an invisible caste labored in silence. These were the Gong Nu, the palace slave girls. They scrubbed the emperor's chamber pots, dressed the concubines in gold-threaded gowns, and whispered through tears in the shadows of imperial grandeur. Their lives were not told in official histories. But behind every fragrance of incense was a girl like Baoji, sold into servitude at age 9, and awakened each day by the sound of a bronze bell, not a voice. The morning bell, 4:30 a.m. Baoji woke before the sun. The copper bell at the corridor's end clanged once, twice, 3 times. The eldest maid, Sister Chun, swept past the doorway. Up. Quickly. The mistress must have her wash water ready before she opens her eyes. They moved like ghosts, silent and barefoot. Baoji slipped on her fraying robe and tiptoed across the frosted stone tiles, carrying the kettle over her shoulder. The palace rule was simple: no noise, no mistakes, no delay. Mistakes meant beatings. Or worse, the night summons. The hierarchy within the harem. The palace was divided not only by walls, but by rank. At the top sat the empress, followed by the imperial consorts, concubines, court ladies, and attendants. Below them were the servant maids, most of whom were enslaved. First-rank maids attended directly to the consorts and managed lower staff. Second-rank maids cleaned, dressed, and fetched. Third-rank maids were seen as replaceable, there to scrub latrines or carry chamber pots. Baoji was third rank. Her name was not recorded in any ledger, only the name of her master, Lady Huayin. You will eat only after your mistress has eaten. You will bathe only if permitted. You will speak only when commanded. You are her shadow, and a shadow has no face. These rules were repeated by Sister Chun during morning lineup, where 40 girls stood in rows, their hands frozen stiff, their faces a mask of obedience. Washing the empress' feet. When Baoji was promoted briefly to assist in the empress's bathing chamber, she witnessed the core of the palace machine, a world that appeared golden but ran on fear. The empress's feet were washed with warmed rose water. Servants stood on their knees holding towels. The water could not be too hot or too cold. One girl, Wenlian, accidentally dipped the porcelain basin at the wrong angle. It splashed. The empress snapped her fan shut. She has offended the dignity of the phoenix. Wenlian was dragged out by 2 eunuchs. She returned days later with a bruised eye and a limp. She never spoke again. Baoji learned to fear even the sound of footsteps. The eunuchs, masters of whispers and punishment. Contrary to their caricatured image, eunuchs were not weak or passive. In the inner court, they were feared enforcers. Castrated as boys and trained for palace service, they rose through ranks, controlled access to the emperor, and administered discipline among the slave girls. Chief Eunuch Lu was a cold-eyed man with fingers like steel tongs. The emperor cannot see filth, he once said. You, girl, your hair is uneven. Report for shaving. Baoji had grown her hair long, hoping it would be noticed. Instead, it was cut to the scalp, her ears boxed, her pride shattered. The eunuchs were judge, jury, and executioner. A girl who talked back might spend the night in the silent room, a cellar beneath the laundry house where no one returned the same. The night summons. Worst of all was the summons after dusk. Each night, a eunuch would deliver a lotus card to a chosen servant. Sometimes it meant delivering tea to the emperor. Other times, something else. No one spoke openly. But everyone knew that concubines weren't the only ones summoned to the dragon bedchamber. If the emperor calls, Sister Chun once whispered, you do not refuse. You smile. You bow. You pray he forgets your name. Baoji never received a card. But her friend Yueping did. She returned the next morning pale and shaking, with blood on her inner sleeve. That afternoon, she was reassigned to the kennel house, a fate considered social death within the palace. Meals and hunger. Despite their proximity to opulence, slave girls ate little. Morning, a bowl of congee and half a steamed bun. Noon, turnip broth, stale rice. Evening, bean curd and tea, if any remained. Food was a hierarchy. First-rank maids ate leftovers from the consorts. Third-rank girls often survived on discarded crusts or mold-scraped scraps. In winter, Baoji would hide roasted chestnuts in her sleeve. Once, she was caught. Her punishment: kneel outside the laundry pavilion for 6 hours in freezing wind. Her knees never fully healed. Hope as an act of rebellion. And yet, amidst the terror, the girls clung to fragments of hope. A forbidden poem carved into the back of a drawer. A stolen cherry blossom petal pressed into cloth. A soft song hummed while scrubbing the floor. Baoji once found a hairpin made of bone, etched with the word freedom in tiny characters. She hid it beneath her bedding. It gave her no power, but it reminded her that someone else once dreamed of escape too. Closing reflection. The inner court was a world within a world, a labyrinth of luxury powered by the broken backs of forgotten girls. Their silence was ritual. Their pain, routine. Behind every embroidered silk robe, behind every imperial banquet, stood a line of bowed heads, empty bowls, and footsteps in the snow. The mandarins of Qing China wore robes embroidered with cranes and dragons, walked with ivory-handled fans, and quoted the Analects with surgical precision. They were the literati elite, guardians of justice and civil order, at least in theory. In practice, many were predators in silk, using their positions to bind the poor in invisible chains. To the peasants of Jiangxi, a magistrate wasn't a servant of the emperor. He was a lord of life and death, wielding a seal that could enslave with a stroke of red ink. The magistrate's seal. Every prefect, sub-prefect, and district official held one, a carved wooden seal bearing the characters, Heaven's Grace. With it, they could legitimize tax claims, order arrests, and, crucially, seize persons as punishment or debt recovery. One village record from 1762 describes how Magistrate Liu of Yichuan converted 42 tenant families into bonded laborers through legal slight. He cited unpaid grain taxes during a famine year. He declared their debts irredeemable. He signed and sealed a document transferring their labor loyalty to a local landlord, his cousin. These families became servants by edict, and no one in the imperial capital noticed. The emperor governs 10,000 li, an old proverb goes. But his shadow does not touch our well. The village of hollow names. In the mountainous outskirts of Hunan, the village of Shueping was known locally as the place of ash-faced children. In 1791, it was struck by a locust swarm and flooding in the same season. Crops failed, temples collapsed, and people were reduced to eating bark. The local tax collector, appointed by a junior magistrate, still demanded the annual head tax. When the villagers pleaded for deferment, he offered a compromise. Sign this paper. It states that for 3 years, you and your children will work for the yamen, without wage, in exchange for your debt being forgiven. Desperate and illiterate, most agreed. The paper was a servitude bond. By the time the provincial governor investigated, over 60 children had been assigned to labor in regional salt farms and brick kilns. No one was punished. The tax collector had already retired, wealthy, untouched, and renamed. Courtroom slavery. The Qing courts were infamous for a practice known as sentence to servitude. If a poor family lost a civil dispute, say, over land or inheritance, the magistrate could issue a ruling that converted the losing party's children into property of the victor as repayment. A court case in Anhui from 1810 documented a widow accused of not repaying a funeral loan. She had borrowed 4 taels of silver. Unable to pay back the debt in full, the judge ruled. Her daughter, Zhenhua, shall be delivered to the creditor's household as a handmaid until the loan is satisfied. The ruling contained no time limit. Zhenhua was 12. The creditor's son took her as a concubine at 16. The loan was never forgiven. The bribe economy of human lives. While Confucian doctrine emphasized virtue and restraint, corruption was endemic. A common saying in the late Qing period went, "Without silver, the law is a drum with no skin." Officials took bribes in tea bricks, jade beads, and slaves. A high-ranking mandarin might receive gifts of servant girls from regional landlords hoping for tax leniency. The girls were dressed in fine silks, but once delivered, they were stripped of names and assigned numbers. Governor-General Qian Yong, who served under the Qing Emperor, received over 160 such girls during his tenure, according to his steward's surviving ledgers. He called them his butterflies. None of their names appear in family records. A girl who enters through the back gate does not exist in the census, wrote a Yamen clerk in 1804. Whispers within the bureaucracy. Not all officials were monsters. Some clerks, often from poor families themselves, tried to resist. A clerk named Su Dafu once refused to sign off on the forced seizure of 2 children as debt servants. He was demoted to grain record keeper and died in obscurity. His private diary survives. In it, he wrote, "I saw the girl cry and wipe her face with her sleeve. She was younger than my own niece. I could not write her name beside the word slave. So I wrote nothing." For that choice, he lost his stipend and was expelled from the district. No one protested. Servitude as reward. Ironically, the Qing also rewarded service with more servants. When military commanders distinguished themselves, the emperor might bestow land and bonded families to work it. In 1775, during the suppression of the Miao Uprising, a general named Guofanghai was gifted 5 oxen, 2 hectares of rice land. 7 families of captured rebels marked 4 generational service. These families were labeled criminal stock and transferred to his estate outside Chengdu. Their descendants remained indentured well into the Republican era. One of them, Lu Fun, was recorded in 1921 as a servant descended from the rebel class. He was still required to bow when his master's son passed by. Closing reflection. Behind every imperial seal was a potential prison. Qing officials, cloaked in the robes of moral virtue, manipulated famine, law, and tax to fuel a shadow economy of human bondage. The emperor reigned in theory. But in practice, it was the magistrates, armed with ink and ambition, who enslaved China's poorest in broad daylight. Next section preview. Section 5, the eunuch class, power, pain, and paradox, will explore the complex lives of Qing eunuchs, castrated boys turned into powerful court brokers, feared tormentors, and sometimes tragic figures caught between servitude and supremacy. Would you like me to begin section 5 now? You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Here is section 5 of The Harsh Realities of Qing Dynasty Servitude, an intimate and haunting dive into the world of Qing eunuchs, whose lives oscillated between absolute obedience and terrifying influence. They were not men. They were not women. They were nukai, imperial eunuchs, forever altered, forever bound. In the palaces of the Qing dynasty, the eunuch was an object of contradiction, pitted and feared, mocked and obeyed, invisible and indispensable. Thousands of boys were castrated, not for medical need or religious purpose, but for one grim reason: to serve. In doing so, they entered a labyrinth of whispered power, institutional cruelty, and personal ruin. The blade and the lie. The process of becoming a eunuch was shrouded in secrecy and deceit. Many poor families, desperate for silver, handed their sons to middlemen, called Dao Gong, who promised work in the Forbidden City. They rarely mentioned what that work required. The operation was crude. In backroom apothecaries or rural sheds, a blade sliced away the penis and testicles. There was no anesthesia. Success depended on stopping the bleeding before death. If he lives 3 days, he may live for years, a Dao Gong said to a trembling father in 1789. If not, well, we bury him quietly. The boy would wake to unimaginable pain, unable to urinate. A reed tube was inserted. If infection set in, he would die. If he lived, he was renamed, registered, and sold. The path to the Forbidden City. Those who survived were marched, or carried, to the capital. There, they entered the eunuch registry office, where they were classified by age, literacy, physical beauty, submissiveness. Boys with delicate features were assigned to high-ranking consorts. Stronger ones cleaned horse stalls or tended coal fires. All were now imperial property. One boy, later known as Sun Yuan, was castrated at 9 and assigned to the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the emperor's residence. They gave me a new name, new clothes, and told me I was lucky, he later wrote. I could no longer run. I could only bow. Life behind the curtain. Despite their mutilation, eunuchs held immense power, especially those who climbed the ranks. The most senior eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, surveillance of the concubines, administration of palace finances, punishment of lower servants. A chief eunuch could summon a general, dismiss a maid, or suppress a scandal, all without the emperor's knowledge. But for most, life was not one of influence, but of humiliation. Eunuchs were often mocked by scholars and laughed at by guards. They were called hollow men, half-souls, or simply it. We wore gold-threaded robes, wrote Sun Yuan, but even dogs would not bark at us. We had no scent. They could not marry. They could not have children. They could not leave the palace without permission. Their bodies were seen as unnatural, their loyalty never quite trusted. The paradox of power. The higher a eunuch rose, the more isolated he became. Li Lianying, one of the most infamous eunuchs in Qing history, became Empress Dowager Cixi's personal attendant. He controlled access to her chamber, approved court appointments, and amassed vast wealth. But Li had no family. He died in silence, surrounded by jade but mourned by none. For every Li, there were thousands like Pinger, a laundry eunuch who once broke a ceramic basin. The attending concubine accused him of sabotage. He was flogged 30 times and left to die behind the kiln. His name was removed from the eunuch rolls 2 weeks later. His room was given to a new boy, fresh from Hunan. When one of us vanished, Sun Yuan recalled, we lit no incense. We spoke no prayers. We simply swept the floor again. The eunuch's role in servitude. Eunuchs were not merely victims, they were also enforcers. They trained palace maids, assigned punishments, and ran interrogation chambers for disobedient servants. They were often more feared than the noblewomen themselves. A record from 1802 details a eunuch who broke a maid's fingers for stealing a plum. The case never reached the magistrate. The eunuch, being part of the imperial household department, was above local law. Even in the outer provinces, senior eunuchs were dispatched to audit salt taxes, oversee imperial tombs, or collect tribute, with power to requisition goods, labor, and people. One such eunuch, Zhao Heqing, enslaved an entire fishing village in Fujian, declaring them bound to imperial salt production. The villagers labored under threat of beatings for 20 years. Burial without a name. Most eunuchs died in the palace. Their bodies were placed in pine boxes and buried in outer cemeteries. Some were cremated and mixed with incense ash. Few received tombstones. They had no descendants to mourn them. No ancestral tablets. No festival offerings. And yet, among themselves, they formed bonds, secret brotherhoods, where one eunuch might declare another his spirit son. They shared stories, old songs, and dreams of a life never lived. "I dreamed once that I had a wife," wrote one elderly eunuch, "and we ate dumplings by the river. I awoke with tears on my face and nothing in my arms." Closing reflection. The eunuch was a servant crafted by cruelty, stripped of manhood, handed power, and then slowly crushed by it. They punished and were punished. They enforced silence and were silenced. They were never free, not even in death. Behind every curtain in the Qing court stood a man with no past, no future, and no name, and yet whose whisper could alter the empire. In imperial China, a child's first breath was supposed to be a blessing, the continuation of the family line, the bearer of ancestral duty. But in the grim realities of Qing society, birth could also mark the beginning of a transaction. Across rural provinces and famine-struck towns, children were not merely raised, they were valued, weighed, and too often sold. The practice was known as "mai nu" for girls, and "mai for boys, the sale of children, legally registered or illicitly transacted, usually in exchange for rice, grain, or copper cash. In some cases, it was for a single winter's survival. "My son is not for sale," a farmer once told a traveling trader. "But for 4 taels of silver, I will lend you his hands until the next harvest." That loan would never be returned. Markets of flesh. The sale of children was often disguised as adoption, fostering, or labor exchange, but in practice it was structured bondage. In towns like Kaifeng, Wuchang, and Luoyang, there were entire alleys informally known as "child rows," where families lined up to display sons and daughters like wares. Boys aged 5 to 10 fetched the highest prices if strong-boned. Girls aged 8 to 14 were prized for beauty, quietness, or domestic skill. Infants were sold cheaply, often as insurance for future labor. A Qing merchant ledger from 1827 listed: girl, age 11, obedient and well-mannered, sold for 9 taels. Twin boys, age 6, sold to Shandong tea house as kitchen hands. Blind boy, age 8, gifted to temple for chanting and begging duties. Such ledgers were taxed by the local yamen, legitimizing the practice. The state, though not formally promoting slavery, looked the other way, especially when officials themselves relied on such servants. The famine contracts. In drought years, the markets swelled with barefoot children. Starving families signed hunger contracts, trading sons and daughters for rice bags or millet sacks. A famine relief report from Shaanxi in 1792 documented over 1,200 children sold in a 2-month span. Family sales, approved by village elders to settle communal debts. Cases where entire sibling groups were dispersed across 5 different towns. "Better to sell than bury," one father said, tears streaking his dirt-caked face. "Let another man beat him, as long as he lives." The hunger contracts usually bore red thumbprints and the phrase, "voluntary surrender due to calamity." But for the children, there was no choice. Many never learned to write their own names. The girl who was never named. In 1804, a girl, later named only Xiaozhi, or Little Wisdom, was sold by her uncle after both her parents died of typhoid. She was 10. The contract stated she would serve as a kitchen hand for 5 years. But her owner, a silk merchant in Hangzhou, kept her in perpetual servitude. At 13, she was raped by his son. At 15, she bore a child, who was taken from her immediately. "You are the pot," the mistress told her. "The child is the soup. It belongs to the household." Xiaoji ran away at 17 and was caught 2 towns over. Her face was branded with the character, runaway, and she was returned. Her fate afterward is unknown. Her original contract, the document that sealed her future, is now archived in the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. The role of middlemen. These child sales were facilitated by human brokers known as renkou fan, literally, traffickers of people. Some operated openly with ledgers and tax stamps. Others worked in secret, traveling village to village with donkeys and bribes. Most charged a 15 to 30% commission and collaborated with household stewards in wealthy estates. A broker named Zhu Rong claimed in a surviving confession, "I took children from the mountains to the lake cities. Poor ones cried when I left them. Rich ones said nothing. Silver never screamed." These traffickers formed a network, allowing households to order children by gender, age, or skill. It was not uncommon for officials to reward subordinates with loyal servants, children freshly taken from drought-stricken counties. Religious and cultural justifications. Confucian ideology, which emphasized filial piety, was twisted to justify child sales. The act was reframed not as betrayal, but sacrifice, a desperate parent ensuring survival of younger siblings or aging grandparents. "A daughter who saves her brothers is fulfilling her duty," read a Qing-era moral pamphlet. Buddhist monks were sometimes complicit too. In exchange for donations, they offered to take in orphaned or sold boys as temple servants, often forcing them into begging circuits or menial labor for decades. These religious sanctuaries became labor farms in disguise. The paper that burned too late. Some children tried to buy their freedom later in life. But without their original sale documents, or a master willing to honor them, escape was impossible. One boy, known only as Tian Yi, worked 27 years in a salt merchant's home. When he begged for his release, the master replied, "Where is your contract? Show me the words that free you." Tian Yi had burned it years earlier in a ritual to sever fate. Now, it was as if he had never existed. He died at age 42, still listed in household records as Salt Servant Number 4. Closing reflection. The sale of children in Qing China was not an aberration, it was a reflection of systemic despair. Beneath the edicts of benevolence, a market churned where flesh replaced grain and names vanished into ledgers. For the poor, a child's laughter could become a final luxury, a sound exchanged for survival, and then silenced forever. In Qing China, the ideal woman walked softly. She did not speak unless spoken to. Her laughter was muted, her stride barely a whisper. And her feet, the most visible sign of her virtue, were expected to be no longer than 3 inches. This grotesque aesthetic, known as foot binding, was not merely a beauty standard. It was a tool of social control, deeply entwined with servitude. Foot binding transformed millions of women, from elite brides to servant girls, into walking symbols of submission. For those already enslaved or indentured, it became both a mark of discipline and a method of domination. "A bound foot is a quiet foot," an old saying went. A quiet foot leads to a quiet wife. But for many girls, it led instead to lifelong pain, disfigurement, and silent suffering. The ritual of breaking. Foot binding usually began between ages 4 and 8. Mothers, or more often, older female relatives, would soak the child's feet in warm water, apply herbs, and then begin the process. The 4 small toes were folded under the sole, breaking the bones. The arch was bent sharply inward. A long bandage was wound from toe to heel, pulled tight enough to force the heel and toes together. The process was repeated daily, with fresh bandages, new fractures, and relentless pressure. My grandmother said, "Don't cry. A woman's pain is her worth," recounted one Qing-era footbound servant named Su Lan. "But I bled for a year. If infection set in, the girl could lose toes. Some died from sepsis. But those who survived were considered marriageable, or, in the case of servants, sellable at higher prices." Status and suffering. In elite households, bound feet were prized. A girl with golden lotuses, feet under 3 inches, was more likely to be taken as a concubine or lady's maid. In lower classes, foot binding was inconsistent. Among peasant women, practicality often trumped fashion. But among servants to gentry families, foot binding was sometimes forced upon young girls after purchase, especially if they were to work in inner chambers or serve mistresses. "She walks too loudly," one noblewoman said of her new maid. "Break her again." Servants with bound feet could not flee. They couldn't chase children, climb walls, or carry heavy loads easily. This made them docile, dependent, and entirely under control. Bound feet in the back courtyard. Life in the inner women's quarters, or gaige, was built around silence. Servants with bound feet were expected to move without sound, never making eye contact with male guests or elder mistresses. Baoji, a maid we met in Section 3, once recalled. "We walked like ghosts. Our steps made no echo. Even our pain had to be silent." Tasks for foot-bound maids included sewing and embroidery, pouring tea and arranging hair, attending the mistress's chamber, standing for hours without rest. Some girls were forced to bind each other's feet as punishment. Elder maids trained new ones in the ritual, reinforcing a cycle of internalized control. "To unbind is to rebel," one mistress warned. "A flat foot brings shame." Enslavement through ornament. Foot binding was more than physical control, it was aesthetic bondage. Girls with bound feet wore tiny embroidered shoes, often with flowers or birds stitched into the silk. Some households displayed these shoes as symbols of household discipline. In Nanjing, one merchant family reportedly hung a row of old servant shoes along the courtyard entrance, each pair labeled with the girl's name and years of service. "It reminds them they are cared for," said the merchant's wife. "And that they belong." This visual branding turned obedience into spectacle. It aestheticized submission, making pain beautiful and silence virtuous. When foot binding was rejected, there were rare, and often tragic, cases of girls who refused the practice. A girl named Wansini, sold at age 10 to a magistrate's concubine, begged not to have her feet bound. She tried to run away twice. The second time, she fell, her broken feet unable to carry her. The household eunuch whipped her in the garden, then bound her feet by force. "She screamed so loudly," said another maid, "they stuffed her mouth with a towel. After a month, her feet festered. The bones reset poorly. She walked with a limp for the rest of her life. The mistress assigned her to latrine duty, branding her unfit for refinement. Her name does not appear in the household books. Only her shoes remain, never completed, never worn." The cultural machinery. Confucian scholars praised foot binding as a sign of female virtue, restraint, modesty, and inner focus. Commentaries on the classic of filial piety included foot binding as a metaphor for loyal suffering. The body must follow the will. The foot, like the heart, must be shaped by duty. Mothers who did not bind their daughters were accused of moral negligence. Servant girls with unbound feet were seen as wild, loud, or unclean. In one Qing moral tract titled Virtues of the Inner Chamber, foot binding was equated with silken manners, and described as a chrysalis that prepares the woman for metamorphosis into duty. The irony, of course, was that many never emerged from that chrysalis. Their wings were broken before they could fly. Closing reflection. Foot binding was not just a cultural tradition, it was a mechanism of bodily servitude, one that fused beauty with obedience, pain with propriety. It crippled millions of girls, especially the poor, transforming their very anatomy into a prison. For those already enslaved or indentured, the bindings ensured not just compliance, but helplessness. In Qing China, a quiet girl was a good girl. And the quietest were those who could not run. The wealth of the Qing Empire did not grow from idle hands. It was pulled from brine, spun from silk, and chipped from the earth by millions of coerced laborers. Beneath every embroidered robe and porcelain bowl lay a trail of sweat, scars, and silence. Salt, silk, tea, and copper, the backbone of Qing commerce, required hands that could be commanded, not paid. And so, the empire devised a system of imperial labor camps, conscripted servitude, and lifetime assignments that blurred the line between workforce and slavery. These weren't prisons in name, but in reality, they were industrial cages. The salt fields of northern Jiangsu. In the scorching flats of Yancheng, salt was harvested by channeling seawater into pans and letting it evaporate under the sun. The work was backbreaking. Feet blistered on salt crystals. Skin cracked and bled. The air stung with salt dust. The labor force included convicted criminals serving indefinite labor sentences, indebted peasants bound by village contracts, purchased children working under stewards, runaway girls caught and reassigned by salt officials. Each morning, a brass gong signaled the start of work. Overseers cracked whips to herd men and boys onto the pans. "If you faint, let the salt eat you," shouted one overseer. The emperor demands his brine. Food was watery millet and pickled turnip. Water was rationed. Those who collapsed were beaten or thrown into the evaporation ditches. Records from 1811 show that in one summer alone, over 300 workers died in a single salt camp near Huai'an. Their names were buried with them, if buried at all. Silk factories and the white thread curse. In the south, Suzhou was the heart of silk. The finest brocades worn by imperial concubines came from spinning houses operated by women and children, many of them bonded servants or orphans. Inside the looms, the air shimmered with fine threads. The noise of clacking spindles never ceased. Fingers bled from hours of twisting, winding, and boiling cocoons. Girls as young as 8 were locked into 10-hour shifts, inhaling silk dust that caused lung infections and chronic coughing, known locally as by Si Zheng, or white thread disease. "My sister's hands were always red," said one survivor's letter. At night, she dreamed of thread and cried in her sleep. Supervisors, often eunuchs or merchant stewards, patrolled the aisles with switches. Errors meant lost wages. Repeated mistakes meant caning or dismissal, which for bonded girls meant expulsion into the streets, or worse, resale to brothels. One girl named Mylan, sold at age 9, worked 6 years before collapsing during a night shift. She was dragged outside and left near a canal. Her body was never found. Mines and the earth's mouths. Copper, tin, and iron fueled the empire's military, coins, and tools. But the mines, especially in Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guangxi, were pits of despair. Known by workers as D-Ko, or the earth's mouths, these mines devoured thousands. The Qing state routinely sentenced criminals and exiles to life in the mines. But many workers were abducted or indebted peasants traded in by village elders in exchange for tax relief. Inside the mines, temperatures reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit in deeper shafts. Ventilation was poor, many suffocated. Collapses were common. Explosions from trapped gas occurred without warning. Shifts ran day and night. Rations were moldy cornmeal and salted radish. Water was often contaminated. A foreman's log from 1794 states. 2 collapsed from heat, buried. Boy fell into shaft, presumed dead. Replacements from Yunnan village arriving tomorrow. Replacements, not names. The empire's invisible engine. The emperor never saw the salt boils or silk mills. He received tribute, smooth brocades, copper ingots, pressed bricks of tea. His ledgers recorded output, not lives lost. But behind every tribute was a hidden ledger, kept in local offices, marked with ink-stained names, often crossed out as workers died or escaped. In a regional yamen from Guangxi, a clerk scribbled, 12 boys from Gaoxian, sold to the mine overseer. Of the 12, 7 remain. This was the only record of them, a fading note on scrap paper, never sent to the capital. Imperial sanction, local exploitation. Although these labor systems were often unofficial, they operated under imperial sanction. Local magistrates were tasked with securing labor during crises. Governors received quotas for silk and copper. Eunuchs supervised tribute delivery and ensured output. Many officials turned a blind eye to abuses, or worse, profited. Some received gifts of laborers in exchange for protecting factory owners. In an edict from 1808, the emperor ordered greater tribute from Jiangxi's copper mines. No mention was made of labor conditions. Instead, the edict praised the diligence of our people and the order of our prefects. That order came at the cost of countless bodies, anonymous, exhausted, erased. The child in the loom. In Suzhou, an old woman named Rulin once told her granddaughter, "When I close my eyes, I still feel the loom." She was sold into a silk workshop at age 7. She worked until her fingers curled permanently from thread twisting. Her name never appeared in factory records. But in her memory, there was one boy, about 5, who arrived crying and barefoot. He was made to carry baskets of silk cocoons. One day, he fell into the boiling vat. No one screamed. The looms kept turning. "We were not people," she said. "We were parts." Closing reflection. The Qing Empire's riches were not built by noble scholars or enlightened rulers, but by hands blistered with salt, lungs filled with silk dust, and feet broken in mines. These laborers were the empire's invisible foundation, extracted, discarded, and forgotten. Behind every imperial tribute stood a child who never saw sunlight again. In the Qing Dynasty, to serve meant to submit completely, body, speech, and soul. Disobedience, even in the smallest form, was not seen as personal failure but as a threat to the cosmic order. A silent maid who looked up, a young boy who spilled tea, a salt worker who dared to rest, these were not lapses. They were treated as rebellion. And rebellion, no matter how small, had a price. The punishments meted out to servants, slaves, and indentured workers were not only cruel, they were calculated, performed as public warning, and documented with cold precision. In the machinery of Qing authority, punishment was the ink that reinforced every contract. The laws of submission. The Great Qing Legal Code was explicit in defining servant disobedience and master punishment. Though it offered nominal protection against excessive cruelty, the loopholes were vast. A master could beat a servant to death, so long as it was not willful. Servants had no right to refuse labor, even under illness. Running away was punishable by branding, mutilation, or forced reselling. Section 333 of the Code allowed a master to punish domestic insubordination with rod, up to 100 strokes, without liability, so long as bones are not broken. But in practice, bones were broken. And no magistrate came. Branding the body. Runaway servants were often captured and branded, not metaphorically, but literally. Using red-hot irons, overseers scorched characters into skin. Tao, runaway. Nu, slave. Zue, criminal. These marks were typically applied to the forehead, the shoulder blade, or the cheek, places that could not be hidden. The pain was searing. But the social stain lasted longer. A bonded boy named Xiangren, who fled a silk factory, was branded with across his back and chained to a loom post for 2 months. He died of fever at 15. His death was not investigated. His name was crossed from the registry with a single brushstroke. Instruments of terror. Each estate, factory, or yamen that employed bonded laborers maintained its own arsenal of punishments. The bamboo rod, thick, soaked in vinegar to sting longer. The tiger bench, a torture device where legs were tied and bent backwards beneath stone weights. Finger stocks, wooden clamps that crushed the joints slowly. Kneeling mats of coarse salt, servants forced to kneel for hours, bleeding into the salt crystals. A household manual from 1815 in Beijing advised. For minor infractions, kneel in gravel. For insolence, the bamboo rod. For theft, lash and expel. But above all, punish in view of the others. Punishment was not only retribution. It was performance. Public shaming and death displays. Some punishments were made public to enforce control over entire communities. Especially in cases involving servants accused of theft, rebellion, or seduction, the Qing system staged executions like rituals of reassertion. In a marketplace in Fuzhou, a young maid named Jinmei was accused of poisoning her mistress's food. The poison was never found. But the rumor spread. She was stripped to her shift, paraded through the market with a placard reading, "Unfaithful servant. Sought to betray the hand that fed her." She was beheaded 2 days later in the rain. Her body left on public display for 12 hours. No burial was permitted. Children were made to walk past her corpse on the way to market, as a lesson. Sexual violence as punishment. Punishment was not limited to lashes and rods. In many private households, sexual violence was the unspoken, and legal, extension of control. Young girls who displeased a master could be reassigned as concubines, raped as correction, or passed to male guests as acts of favor. When questioned by yamen officials, masters often stated, "She was mine. She disobeyed. I claimed her as I saw fit." Legal redress was virtually impossible for female servants. Virginity, purity, and chastity were valued, but only in elite daughters. In servants, they were tools of punishment or trade. A 13-year-old bonded girl named Yui, after breaking a porcelain vase, was tied to a bedpost and raped by her master's son. She hung herself 3 days later using silken thread from the loom she worked. Rebellion and its price. Despite the fear, some servants did fight back. In 1807, in the outskirts of Chengdu, a group of 5 bonded boys working in a copper smelting camp rebelled, killing an overseer with hammers. Their revolt lasted less than an hour. All were captured by local militia. They were sentenced to death by slow slicing, a punishment reserved for traitors and parricides. Executed at dawn, in front of their fellow laborers. One was just 12. A clerk recorded the event. "Let the blood of 5 wash the rebellion from the soil." That clerk's name is recorded. The boys are not. The fear that lived in silence. Many servants lived decades under the shadow of punishment without ever rebelling. They complied. They smiled. They survived. A former salt worker named Chen Shuang once said in an interview late in life, "The worst punishment was not the rod. It was waking each day knowing it could be your turn." She had seen 36 girls disappear over 20 years. Some were beaten. Some sold. Some silenced behind locked doors. She never asked. She never looked back. She simply learned to fold her hands correctly, walk with her head bowed, and never, ever, speak above a whisper. Closing reflection. The punishments inflicted on Qing servants were not exceptions, they were foundations. They turned the threat of force into a quiet, ambient terror that haunted every corner of imperial society. Pain was the cost of disobedience. Silence was the only defense. In Qing China, obedience was not taught, it was carved into the skin, the soul, and the memories of those too poor to protest. The Forbidden City's inner court was a world unto itself, a place where beauty was power, loyalty was currency, and survival required cunning. It was here that the boundaries between concubines, maids, and eunuchs blurred and sharpened in equal measure, creating a labyrinth of shifting alliances and deadly rivalries. For those born outside the palace walls, entry into the inner court meant a transformation from commoner to property, body and soul surrendered to the emperor's will, or at least to those who held his favor. The court structure. At the top sat the emperor, surrounded by his empress and a rotating circle of consorts and concubines. Below them were imperial maids, gongnu, servants responsible for day-to-day chores. Handmaidens, personal attendants to the higher-ranked women. Eunuchs, the all-seeing eyes and enforcers within the court. Each class had its own privileges and dangers. A concubine might wield immense influence, shaping policy, bearing heirs, or becoming a de facto ruler. But she was always vulnerable to the emperor's favors, whims, or palace intrigue. A maid served quietly, invisible but essential, often preyed upon or used as pawns. The concubine's game. One of the most famous figures was Consort Ling, a woman of humble origin who rose to prominence through charm and intelligence. To please the emperor was to hold the world, she said. But to keep his favor was to fight shadows. Concubines competed fiercely for the emperor's attention. This competition sometimes turned brutal. Poisoning or sabotaging rivals' food. Spreading rumors of illness or disloyalty. Enlisting eunuchs or maids as spies. In 1783, an accusation of witchcraft against a favored consort led to a palace purge. Several maids were executed for allegedly conspiring to curse the consort, though the truth remains hidden behind palace walls. The maid struggle. For maids, life was a delicate balance of obedience and survival. Many were sold as children, like Ling Mei, who entered service at 8. Our voices were quiet as whispers, our footsteps lighter than feathers, she recalled. We learned quickly, silence kept us alive. Maids were expected to anticipate every desire, endure insults, and carry burdens both physical and emotional. Punishment was swift for mistakes, but rewards were rare. Sometimes a maid could become a favorite of a concubine, gaining relative protection. Other times, maids were coerced into dangerous liaisons or forced to spy on one another. Eunuchs, the hidden hands. Eunuchs played a crucial role, both as enforcers and as power brokers. One senior eunuch, Wei Zhang, controlled access to the emperor's chambers, deciding who could enter or leave. His influence made him feared and respected. But eunuchs also suffered humiliations and restrictions unique to their status, caught between male and female spheres, wielding power yet barred from true intimacy or family. Intrigue and betrayal. Palace life was a constant web of intrigue. In 1797, a maid named Xiao Lan was accused of leaking secret correspondences between consorts. She was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually died of starvation. Rumors spread that a rival concubine had orchestrated the plot, seeking to eliminate competition. No records confirm the truth. The emotional cost. Behind the grandeur and silks lay loneliness and fear. A concubine's diary reveals. I smile for the emperor but weep in my chamber. Trust is a blade that cuts deep. Maids like Ling Mei often spoke of dreams of freedom, of a life beyond walls, of families lost and futures stolen. Closing reflection. The inner court of the Qing dynasty was a place of extreme contrasts, beauty and brutality, power and powerlessness. Women navigated complex hierarchies where servitude was both a curse and a chance for influence. In this gilded cage, survival meant mastering the art of silence, deception, and patience. In Qing China, childhood was not always a time of innocence and play. For many born into or sold into servitude, it was a beginning marked by hardship, limited opportunity, and an often invisible struggle against fate. The empire's machinery relied heavily on these children, not merely as labor, but as symbols of continuity, loyalty, and sometimes, of sacrifice. Born into servitude. Many children of servants and slaves were born within the confines of household compounds, orphanages, or labor camps. From birth, their futures were often predetermined. Sons were expected to serve their family's master, following in their parents' footsteps. Daughters were groomed for domestic service or early marriage, often arranged to consolidate household labor. Few ever escaped these roles. The question of education. Education for servant children was rare, limited, and highly pragmatic. Basic literacy, enough to read contracts or memorize household rules, was sometimes taught, but only to those deemed trustworthy or promising. Others remained illiterate, reinforcing their dependence. One eunuch memoir recalls, "I learned to read only so I could memorize the emperor's orders. No books for pleasure, no poems." Children were also taught obedience, ritual behavior, and the strict codes of Confucian hierarchy, lessons designed to reinforce their place. Lost childhoods. Play and childhood freedoms were luxuries few servant children knew. They often worked from dawn to dusk, caring for younger siblings, tending livestock, or performing menial household tasks. A girl named Mei Ling wrote in a secret journal, "I wish to run in the fields, but my feet are tied by chores and my hands by threads. The only freedom I have is in my dreams." Many such journals, scribbled in hidden corners, were destroyed upon discovery. Broken dreams and silent acceptance. Despite hardship, some children dreamed of escape, of education, marriage beyond servitude, or simply freedom. But the empire's social structure was rigid. Opportunities for advancement were limited to a few. Eunuchs could rise in palace ranks, but at great personal cost. Some servants might be freed, but often into poverty. Most lived and died within the household, invisible and forgotten. The weight of expectation. Families often relied on children's servitude to repay debts or secure favor. A family might sell a child to repay taxes, hoping that loyalty would eventually bring security. But often, these children became ghosts, living shadows of their families, cut off by distance and circumstance. Closing reflection. Children in Qing servitude were caught between worlds, too young to rebel, too bound to change their fate. Their lives remind us that servitude was not only an adult burden but a cycle forged from birth, reinforced by education, and sealed by silence. In the Qing dynasty, death was not the great equalizer for all, especially not for those trapped in servitude. The bodies of servants and slaves were treated differently from those of free citizens, reflecting the same rigid social order that governed their lives. From hurried burials to denied ancestral rites, death marked the final chapter in a life of hardship and silence. Burial practices for servants. Most servants were buried in separate cemeteries, often on the outskirts of towns or estates. These burial grounds were less maintained and less honored than those of their masters or the local gentry. A record from a rural yamen describes: servants' graves shall not exceed 1 foot in depth, nor be marked with stone, to remind descendants of their humble origin. Some families did not even claim their deceased servants, leaving bodies to be buried in mass pits without names or ceremonies. Denied ancestral rights. Ancestor worship was central to Qing culture, an expression of filial piety and family continuity. But for servants, participation in these rites was minimal or forbidden. Without proper ancestral tablets or family halls, many servant spirits were believed to wander, restless and unacknowledged. Local folklore spoke of hungry ghosts, spirits of those who died without proper rites, often servants or dispossessed peasants. The spiritual hierarchy. Spiritual beliefs mirrored social ones. Servants were thought to possess lower status spirits. In one Qing-era religious text, it is written, "The spirit of a servant must serve eternally, even beyond death." This belief justified neglect in burial and ritual, reinforcing the idea that their souls were part of the master's property. Stories of servant afterlife. A legend from Anhui province tells of old Wang, a servant who was buried outside the family cemetery. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, a faint light was said to appear by his unmarked grave. Villagers believed it was his soul seeking justice or longing for recognition. Escape beyond death. Some servants turned to spirit mediums or secret rituals, hoping to gain freedom in the afterlife. These clandestine ceremonies were often punished if discovered, as the Qing state feared disruptions to spiritual order. Closing reflection. For Qing servants, death did not bring peace or dignity. Their bodies were forgotten, their spirits neglected, as if servitude chained them beyond life itself. In the Qing Empire, even in death, the final chains remained. Though bound by chains of servitude, many Qing servants and slaves refused to accept their fate passively. Their stories are often lost to history, buried beneath layers of silence and suppression. Yet acts of resistance, both subtle and violent, persisted, a testament to human resilience. Everyday acts of defiance. Not all resistance was dramatic. For many, it was the small, persistent no in daily life. Refusing extra work without punishment. Stealing small items as compensation for stolen wages or abuse. Feigning illness to escape harsh labor. Sabotaging tools or looms to disrupt production. A maid named Xiao Fan reportedly unraveled the fine embroidery of a mistress's robe after being punished unjustly, a silent but potent rebellion. Escape attempts. Running away was a common but dangerous choice. Servants risked capture, branding, or death. A record from Zhejiang province in 1820 lists dozens of missing servants, many of whom were later recaptured. Some traveled hundreds of miles to find refuge in Buddhist temples, remote villages, or bustling port cities. Organized rebellions. Occasionally, resistance became open rebellion. In 1813, bonded laborers in a copper mine near Chongqing staged a revolt after brutal overseers increased workloads without food. The rebellion was swiftly crushed, and leaders were executed publicly. The role of secret societies. Some servants found solidarity in underground networks like the Tiandihui, Heaven and Earth Society, which opposed Qing rule. Membership offered a sense of community and occasional aid in escape or rebellion. Songs and stories as resistance. Folklore and song preserved the voices of the oppressed. Many folk ballads lamented the hardships of servitude, embedding coded messages of hope and resistance. Closing reflection. Resistance among Qing servants was a constant, if often invisible, force. It revealed the unbreakable spirit beneath layers of oppression, a reminder that even in servitude, hope flickered. In the Qing dynasty, eunuchs occupied a paradoxical space. they were simultaneously enslaved servants and influential power brokers within the imperial court. Castrated to eliminate familial ties and ensure loyalty, eunuchs became indispensable cogs in the machinery of palace governance, wielding authority while remaining socially marginalized. The path to eunuchdom. Many boys were sold or forcibly conscripted into eunuch service, often from impoverished families. Others were criminals sentenced to castration. The process itself was brutal, removing not only physical organs but also severing a boy's path to traditional family roles. One eunuch memoir described, "I was no longer a son, no longer a man. I belonged to the palace." Duties and influence. Eunuchs managed palace logistics, controlled access to the emperor, and supervised the women's quarters. Some rose to positions of great influence, acting as advisors, gatekeepers, and even political manipulators. Wei Zhang, a senior eunuch, famously controlled imperial edict circulation, shaping decisions behind closed doors. Social marginalization. Despite power, eunuchs were often despised or pitted by society, viewed as unnatural or cursed. They were barred from marriage and excluded from traditional family rituals. Their identity was one of service without belonging, wielding power but forever isolated. Paradoxes of power. Eunuchs' authority came at a personal cost. Absolute loyalty demanded unquestioning obedience, while ambition risked ruin or death. They were simultaneously feared and scorned, empowered and imprisoned by their own status. Closing reflection. The eunuchs of Qing China embody the contradictions of servitude, where power and powerlessness intertwine, and identity is reshaped by sacrifice and survival. To understand the systemic cruelty of Qing servitude, one must look not only at the households and palaces, but at the Great Qing Legal Code, a vast, intricate body of law that regulated every corner of life, including the lives of the enslaved. On the surface, the law offered structure. In practice, it provided justification for exploitation, giving masters immense authority over the lives, and deaths, of their servants. The law of hierarchy. The Qing Code enshrined Confucian hierarchy into law. Filial piety, patriarchal rule, and the unquestioned dominance of the master were legally protected principles. One central doctrine declared, "The relationship between master and servant shall mirror that of father and son, strict, hierarchical, and permanent." This meant that resistance or disobedience from a servant was often judged more harshly than if committed by a free person. Punishments codified. The code detailed specific punishments for servants. Disobedience, up to 100 strokes with the heavy bamboo rod. Attempted escape, branding, reselling, or forced hard labor. Striking a master, immediate execution, regardless of cause. Theft, mutilation or forced public confession. There was a chilling clause stating, "A servant who strikes his master, even in self-defense, shall be treated as if rebelling against the state." This effectively stripped servants of all legal protection. Master impunity. Masters were legally permitted to discipline servants as one disciplines a child. If a servant died under punishment, the law required investigation only if malice was suspected. As a result, many deaths were written off as unfortunate consequence of correction. Wealthy families often bribed local magistrates to ignore evidence of abuse or to label deaths as illness. Servant contracts and debt bondage. Legal servitude was frequently disguised as contracted labor. These contracts, often written in classical Chinese beyond the comprehension of the bonded individual, bound families into generations of service. Contracts could be transferred, sold, or inherited. Servants had no legal means to dissolve the agreement unless freed by the master. Debt bondage was legal and enforceable through local courts. A contract might read, "This servant, given in bond to repay rice debts, shall serve without wage or protest until such a time the debt is resolved, or forever, should debt remain. In reality, the debt was rarely resolved. Loopholes and exploitation. Even when laws were in place to protect servants, such as prohibiting murder or excessive cruelty, loopholes abounded. If a servant was labeled rebellious, harsher punishment could be justified. Moral correction was a defense for extreme measures. Women servants had even fewer protections, often subsumed under household discipline laws rather than personal rights. The role of local magistrates. Magistrates were meant to adjudicate servant disputes, but in practice, they often sided with masters, who were wealthier and socially dominant. A servant bringing a complaint risked retaliation, blacklisting, or being resold. In one 1824 case, a maid accused her master of repeated assault. She was publicly flogged for insulting a superior. Suppression of rebellion. Any collective action among servants, a refusal to work, an escape pact, or a whispered plan, was labeled rebellion, a crime equivalent to sedition. The Qing Code emphasized, "Let not the servant forget his place, for order arises from obedience, and chaos from insolence." This legal ideology reduced the servant to a legal object, owned, controlled, and punished at will. Closing reflection. The Great Qing Legal Code was not just a tool of governance, it was a weapon of control. It wrapped oppression in the language of righteousness, enabling cruelty under the guise of order. For servants, the law did not offer justice. It offered justification for their suffering. Far from the towering walls of the Forbidden City and the bustling streets of Beijing or Suzhou, servitude in rural Qing China took on a quieter, but no less brutal, form. In the countryside, where the majority of the population lived, landlords, clans, and village elites held unchecked authority over bonded peasants and household laborers. These remote systems operated with fewer witnesses, less oversight, and often no formal documentation. In many cases, servitude blurred into feudalism, where a person's status was decided not by law but by birth, land, and custom. The power of the landlord. In a village in Shaanxi or Fujian, the wealthiest man, the diju, or landlord, functioned as master, judge, and enforcer. His land provided income not only through crops, but also by leasing homes to dependent families, many of whom were in permanent debt bondage. Servants in rural estates often included tenant farmers' children, pledged to the landlord for generations. Widows working in kitchens or cleaning in exchange for rice. Orphan boys sent to watch animals, often unpaid. Village women given to landowners as concubines or wet nurses. There were no palace guards or yamen officials here, only the bamboo rod, the ancestral tablet, and the landlord's word. Lineage clans and internal hierarchies. In southern provinces like Guangdong, powerful clan lineages organized villages into tightly controlled units, where rank within the family determined labor. The lesser branch families, often poorer, sometimes the illegitimate or mixed-blood descendants, were relegated to servitude, even if they bore the same surname. They were barred from accessing ancestral shrines, marrying upward within the clan, holding land or receiving formal education. In one case, a boy born to a maid and a clan elder was never acknowledged by the main family. He served the shrine of his own ancestors, forbidden to light incense unless supervised. Female servitude in the villages. Village girls faced particularly harsh conditions. A common practice was the tanjiangxi, child brides bought as domestic servants with the expectation they'd later marry a family's son. These girls were beaten for disobedience, worked from dawn to dusk, punished for infertility, sometimes discarded or sold again if the husband died or left. A girl named Yuanli, taken as a tanjiangxi at age 6, wrote decades later, I was neither daughter, wife, nor servant. I was a thing waiting to be used. Tax and labor demands. When drought or famine struck, the imperial court rarely intervened directly. Instead, local gentry collected taxes, often extracting labor in lieu of grain or silver. This led to forced conscription of boys into road building or river dredging, seizure of girls to work in tribute weaving, families offering up children as bondservants to avoid punishment. Local documents record entire villages collapsing into servitude after a single failed harvest. The myth of kindly masters. Elite Confucian writings often idealized the village landlord as a benevolent patriarch, who fed the poor, employed the landless, and guided the ignorant. But in practice, abuse was rarely punished. The landlord was too powerful, the victims too afraid. A traveling magistrate in 1836 visiting a Jiangxi estate wrote in his diary, "They call him Uncle Fang, but the people tremble when he walks. He owns the river and the rice, and the daughters of all who fail to pay him." Silence by necessity. Villagers who tried to complain were branded as ungrateful or rebellious. Entire families could be exiled, or worse, banned from using communal land and water. The result was a culture of forced politeness, where smiles hid bruises, and phrases like, "The master is generous. My family is fortunate to serve," became survival scripts. Closing reflection. In Qing China's countryside, servitude was as pervasive as the soil, hidden under generations of custom, enforced by tradition more than law. There were no formal chains. Instead, there was inheritance, silence, hunger, and fear. While the court servants faced the emperor's wrath, the villagers faced something quieter and perhaps crueler: eternal ownership without recognition. Official records of Qing China preserved the voices of emperors, generals, scholars, and magistrates, but rarely those of servants, slaves, or laborers. Their lives were meant to be silent, their thoughts erased before ink touched paper. And yet, some wrote anyway. Smuggled letters, hidden diaries, bamboo carvings, and posthumous confessions survive in fragments, enough to reveal a world beneath the surface. These are not histories of war or dynasty. These are the words of people owned. The Diary of a Palace Maid, Ling Xiu. Discovered in 1901 during the Boxer Rebellion looting of the Forbidden City, Ling Xiu's diary was a cloth-bound book tucked beneath floorboards. She had been a maidservant in the imperial kitchen during the reign of the Daoguang Emperor. Her entries were written in candlelight after hours, using kitchen ink. The Empress scolded the rice too hot. I knelt for an hour. Lady Ming spilled soup, I was beaten instead. I do not cry anymore. I have learned to bow as the soup cools. She wrote of friendships with other maids, whispered stories behind silk curtains, and her secret love for a eunuch named One. Both were dismissed after a rumor of improper closeness. She was never seen again. A bonded boy's bamboo testament. In a merchant's household in Guangzhou, researchers found a carved bamboo slat used in weaving that read, "I am called Ko. I am 14. My father gave me away for rice. I serve 19 hours each day. I have not seen the sun in 3 weeks. This bamboo is mine. It knows me." It is believed he etched these words during breaks at the loom, scratching with a broken nail or pin. A widow's lament, burned to survive. In a rural shrine in Anhui, a collection of ashes beneath an incense altar revealed partially scorched paper, writings of a widow named Zhen Yi, kept as a household servant after her husband's death. She wrote in secret, "My husband died in debt. I became their cook. Their child calls me Old Ghost. I once had a name. I once had red silk in my hair. I remember it." Her entries were burned by hand, a desperate attempt to erase the evidence should her master discover them. Servants' confessions before execution. In Qing criminal archives, sometimes servants spoke plainly, but only before execution, when nothing more could be taken from them. One young woman, sentenced to death for poisoning her abusive master, declared, "He took my body, my voice, my child. I took his tea. Let heaven weigh us." Another servant, a boy named Liang who struck a magistrate's son after years of abuse, wrote, "You say I rebelled. I say I breathed." The forbidden booklet of shadow names. A rare text known as the Yingming Lu, Record of Shadow Names, circulated briefly in underground circles during the late Qing. It listed the names and short stories of abused or killed servants, mostly women, in large households. Copied in secret by sympathetic concubines and Buddhist nuns, it was a memorial, a rebellion in ink. The preface read, "These are names without tombs. May their ink last longer than their chains." Most copies were destroyed by censors. Only fragments survive today. Literature as witness. Fiction from the Qing era occasionally hinted at the brutal truth behind closed doors. In band plays and folk songs, the clever maid who escapes or the loyal boy who dies unjustly became recurring figures, avatars of quiet suffering. One line, from an anonymous folk ballad, says, "I serve beneath the moon's eye, my tears the salt of the emperor's soup." Closing reflection. These voices, though nearly erased, break through the silence of empire like cracks in a jade statue. They are fragile, defiant, raw, and real. Through bamboo, ash, confession, and ink, the people the Qing tried hardest to forget remembered themselves. While Qing Dynasty servitude was uniquely embedded in Confucian hierarchy, it was not an isolated phenomenon. Across continents, systems of forced labor thrived under different names: slavery, serfdom, indenture, debt bondage. Each system had its own rules, philosophies, and punishments, but all shared a core truth: human lives commodified. This section traces how Qing servitude fits within a global story of exploitation, not to equate experiences, but to illuminate what made Qing oppression both similar and distinctively cruel. Chattel slavery in the Americas versus Qing servitude. Atlantic slavery, especially in the 17th to 19th centuries, was defined by racial ownership, lifetime bondage, and hereditary status. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported in brutal conditions to work plantations in the Americas. Similarities. Both systems permitted ownership of people as legal property. Physical punishment, mutilation, and death were common disciplinary tools. Resistance was met with collective punishment. Children could be born into bondage. Differences. Qing slavery was not racialized, but rooted in social class and hierarchy. Some Qing servants could earn manumission or buy their freedom, though rare. American slaves were usually barred from education. Some Qing household slaves, especially palace eunuchs, were highly literate and politically powerful. One might say Qing servitude was softer in theory, but no less brutal in practice, especially due to its normalization within the Confucian moral order. Russian serfdom and Qing rural servitude. In Tsarist Russia, serfs were bound to landowners much like Qing tenant peasants and household laborers. Russian serfs couldn't be bought and sold individually after 1649, but they lived and died on estates they could not leave. Similarities. Both were tied to land and family lineage, creating intergenerational bondage. Local lords acted as judges, taxers, and punishers, often with unchecked power. Religious ideology reinforced obedience: orthodoxy in Russia, Confucianism in China. Differences. Russian serfs had feudal obligations to the state, military service, taxes. Qing servants were often not legally acknowledged as individuals with any claim to land or the emperor's protection. Ottoman slavery versus Qing inner court. In the Ottoman Empire, palace slaves could rise to positions of immense power, such as the harem eunuchs, janissaries, and even viziers. This resembles the Qing palace eunuch system, where castrated servants ran vast sections of the Forbidden City and manipulated imperial succession. But there's a dark paradox: in both systems, those closest to power were also those most mutilated and controlled. A eunuch in Istanbul or Beijing might command armies or write policy, but he could not father children, marry, or be remembered in family lines. Power was bought with bodily sacrifice. Debt bondage in South Asia versus Qing peasant servitude. In India, bonded labor emerged from caste systems and landholding patterns. Poor families pledged their labor to creditors, often for generations. In Qing China, indenture contracts mimicked this. Parents sold children to pay debts, with little expectation of freedom. Shared features. Vague, shifting contracts with no expiration. Servants became invisible extensions of household labor. Girls especially vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Both systems reinforced servitude with ritual, shame, and legal ambiguity. The uniqueness of Qing servitude. What makes Qing servitude stand out? It was Confucianized. Qing law did not call slavery a moral evil. Instead, it was an extension of filial discipline and family order. Servitude was part of maintaining harmony, a sacred, twisted duty. It was hidden in plain sight. Unlike Atlantic slavery's mass brutality or serfdom's revolts, Qing bondage operated in quiet rooms, behind paper doors and silken robes. It relied not on chains, but on silence, debt, shame, and custom. It lasted longer than most systems. Qing slavery was not abolished by revolution or reform until 1910, and even then, vestiges persisted into the Republic era, especially in rural China. Global echoes of pain. From Georgia's cotton fields to Siberia's frozen farms, to the opium dens of Guangzhou, there existed an invisible fraternity of the oppressed, those born into a world where their bodies were not their own. While the systems differed in method and ideology, they were unified in outcome. Lives constrained. Dignity denied. History distorted. Closing reflection. Qing servitude was neither the most extreme nor the most visible system of bondage in world history. But it was among the most pervasive, ritualized, and normalized. In comparing it with the great traumas of global slavery, we are reminded that oppression does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, over generations, until the whisper becomes law. By the late 19th century, the once mighty Qing Empire stood on crumbling foundations. Foreign invasions, internal rebellion, and economic collapse had shaken every pillar of imperial China. But amid the political chaos, one of the oldest institutions, servitude, endured, quietly adapting to new realities even as reformers shouted for modernity. Abolition comes late. While the British abolished slavery in 1833, and Russia freed its serfs in 1861, Qing China retained legal servitude well into the 20th century. Though whispers of reform grew louder in the final decades of the empire, slavery was deeply embedded in both legal code and cultural belief. It wasn't until 1906, under the influence of Western pressure and internal reform, that the Qing court declared slavery officially abolished. The edict stated, "Henceforth, persons may not be bought or sold. Bond contracts shall not bind life." But the reality was far murkier. Why abolition failed at first? The 1906 proclamation was largely symbolic. Enforcement was weak, and the very officials tasked with abolition were often slave owners themselves. Three major obstacles blocked real change. Confucian ideology still saw servants as part of household order. Landowners resisted, fearing the collapse of cheap labor systems. Poor families still sold children, now under euphemisms like adoption or marriage alliances. Even after the 1911 fall of the Qing and the rise of the Republic, reports of slave markets continued, hidden in rural provinces, masked by rituals and contracts. Resistance at the end. As Qing power waned, servants began to push back, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. In 1908, a group of bonded women in Shaanxi escaped their estate and sought refuge in a Buddhist convent. When local authorities tried to retrieve them, the nuns refused, sparking a legal battle that made headlines in provincial newspapers. The women won. In Guangzhou, secret literacy schools for servant children began appearing in Christian mission compounds. Girls who once had no names began writing them down. And in Beijing, reform-minded officials began organizing freed servant registries, a modest attempt to document those seeking independence. Transformation, not disappearance. After abolition, the institution of servitude didn't vanish. It transformed. Terms like household servant, contracted laborer, or wet nurse continued to describe roles that mirrored slavery in all but name. Poor girls were adopted into wealthy families as daughters, but kept uneducated and unpaid. Rural peasants still bound to landowners worked without contracts, under constant threat. Urban servant girls were recruited through brokers who charged training fees that locked them in debt for years. These were new chains, forged in the language of modern employment, but rooted in centuries of coercion. Cultural amnesia and suppression. Post-Qing governments, eager to modernize, often ignored or erased the memory of servitude. Textbooks skipped over the 1906 decree. Families never spoke of the maids or eunuchs who vanished after manumission. Memoirs of former servants were discouraged, and historical records were lost in wars and revolutions. Even today, many descendants of Qing-era servants do not know their origins. The weight of inheritance. In southern provinces like Jiangxi and Guangdong, local clans continued to mark certain surnames or bloodlines as impure, a whispered legacy of servitude. These lingering stigmas affected marriage, job opportunities, and community trust well into the 20th century. Remembering resistance. Yet, the stories of those who resisted, escaped, or survived lived on in fragments. Folk ballads about maids who vanished into forests. Temple murals showing children carrying tools with broken chains. Oral traditions in remote villages, where old women told granddaughters, "Never kneel, no matter who feeds you." These were small, defiant embers glowing in the ruins of the empire. Closing reflection. The fall of the Qing dynasty did not bring immediate freedom for its lowest subjects. It brought confusion, mutation, and often a relabeling of old oppression under new political slogans. But it also brought something else: memory, language, and resistance. The long shadow of servitude continues to haunt the margins of Chinese history. And it is there, in the shadows, that the truth most clearly shines. The Qing Empire fell in 1912. Its emperors, eunuchs, and gilded palaces are now pages in history books. But the systems of domination, dependency, and silence it nurtured did not die with the dragon throne. They survived, altered, renamed, disguised, yet ever present in the structure of modern Chinese society. Today, the echoes of servitude persist not in visible chains, but in attitudes, rituals, and the quiet places where no one speaks of the past. The disappearance of the word servant. In post-1949 communist China, all talk of slavery or servitude was erased from public discourse. The People's Republic proclaimed the destruction of feudal remnants, but many practices simply went underground. Domestic workers were now helping hands. Contract farmers bound by impossible debts worked self-employed. Migrant laborers moving from countryside to city were never labeled as bonded, even when they lived in barracks and worked 14-hour days for no benefits. The language changed, but the power dynamics often stayed the same. Household hierarchies reimagined. In urban apartments from Shanghai to Shenzhen, it is still common to see live-in, i.e., aunties, who clean, cook, and raise children for middle and upper-class families. Though technically free and paid, many of these women sleep on kitchen floors or in storage rooms, are on call 24/7, often give up their own families in the countryside for years, endure abuse silently, fearing dismissal or blacklisting. The modern IE is not a Qing-era slave, but she lives under the ghost of that structure, where labor is feminized, invisible, and made to feel like a debt of gratitude rather than a contract of equals. The stigma of origins. In certain regions of China, especially in Guangdong, Jiangxi, and parts of Sichuan, rural families still whisper about bad bloodlines linked to past servitude. These whispered genealogies mark people as not of pure descent from slave ancestry, unfit to marry into proper clans. Though officially denounced, such social stigmas can still affect marriages, education, and village status, even among younger generations who have no idea of their own ancestors' history. Labor exploitation in the modern era. China's explosive economic growth in the 1980s and 1990s brought millions of rural laborers into cities, where they worked under harsh conditions for meager pay. These Nongmingan, peasant workers, are not called slaves, yet. Many work under coercive contracts with withheld wages. ID cards are confiscated to prevent escape. They have limited access to legal recourse or social welfare. Death or injury on construction sites is often covered up. In Qing times, this would have been called contract bondage. Today, it's called economic development. Silence in the archives, silence in the home. One of the deepest legacies of Qing servitude is cultural amnesia. It's not just the government that avoids the topic, families themselves have often refused to remember. Ask the descendants of maids, concubines, or child servants what their great-grandmothers did, and you may hear. She was taken in by a kind family. She worked in a house, but it wasn't bad. That was long ago. We don't speak of it. This silence is not ignorance. It is a defense mechanism, built to protect dignity in a culture where shame still clings to the memory of enslavement. Why the silence persists. Confucian morality teaches obedience, deference, and the sanctity of family hierarchy. Questioning past servitude often means questioning one's elders. National pride prefers stories of resilience, not oppression. The victims themselves rarely left written records, and few wanted to burden their descendants with pain. But silence, however comforting, carries a cost. It allows oppression to mutate, to pass invisibly from generation to generation. Echoes in popular culture. In modern Chinese dramas, maidservants are often romanticized as loyal, clever, or secretly noble. Rarely are they shown being raped by masters, sold by parents, starving in kitchens, dying unnamed in cold alleyways. This romantic retelling serves a purpose. It softens collective guilt and turns history into fable. A flicker of reckoning. In recent years, a few scholars, filmmakers, and artists have begun digging into these buried truths. Oral history projects in rural China have uncovered fragments of slave registries, bondage contracts, diaries of concubines, eunuch testimonies smuggled out of court. One documentary in 2021 titled, "My Grandmother Was a Servant," caused a stir before it was quietly pulled from distribution. The silence, it seems, still speaks louder than truth. Final reflection, the last chain. The story of Qing servitude does not end with an edict, a revolution, or a government. It ends, and continues, with a silence passed down like inheritance. The final chain is not iron, bamboo, or law. The final chain is forgetting. Epilogue, a name remembered. Let us remember one. A girl named Ling Xiu, palace maid, who wrote in her diary, "I do not cry anymore. I have learned to bow as the soup cools." She was never recorded in official court logs. But now you know her name. And that is how silence ends.